Give me liberty and give me Annette.
Welcome to Annette on Life, Liberty, and Happiness, a podcast where we talk about the politics, Constitution, history, and pretty much anything else I want to talk about. You can find this podcast on AnnetteTalks.com, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, etc., and YouTube.com/Annette Talks. And today I'm very excited to have Dinesh D'Souza joining me. Welcome, Dinesh.
Good to be on the show. Looking forward to it.
Great. And just to let the audience know, you are here to talk about your movie Trump Card, right, which is based on your book, United States of Socialism. And I started reading your book because I want to become an expert on socialism. I feel like that's the big threat that's facing us today, which is very strange because living through the Cold War, you would never think this would be something we would have to worry about, in 2020. But I picked up your book first because it's the most recent and it talks about what we're facing with modern day socialism as opposed to, what they were doing in the 70s and the 80s and that kind of thing. And I have to tell you, when I was reading it, I kept hearing your voice like you were reading it to me. It was very funny because you have a very distinctive voice. And so then your movie, Trump Card, was based on the book, right? And you said before we started recording, you said it had to go straight to on demand and DVD.
Yeah, the theatrical picture is very uneven. And so we didn't want, it'd be frustrating for people to say, those guys saw the movie, we can't see the movie. So that's why we released it to DVD and video on demand. So it's now on a whole bunch of platforms, from Apple iTunes to Google, YouTube, the movie site called Fandango, a couple of cable systems, Xfinity, Comcast. So TrumpCardTheMovie.com, that's where you can find out where the movie is playing. And as you can see, a movie and a book are two different things. A book is kind of an argument with references. And a movie is an emotional narrative, a kind of story or journey that tells you the story of socialism and how it got here and who's behind it and kind of why it's evil and how we stop it. So at the end of a movie, you want to feel like you've been through an experience and been transformed in some way internally. A movie appeals to the head and the heart, whereas a book, I would say, appeals mainly to the mind.
Right. And the other thing that I liked about the movie was that it was updated to include some of the COVID reactions that we've had, like the restrictions on church. And I thought, because you wrote the book starting in 2018, right? And then the movie came after. So obviously, at least parts of the movie were filmed in 2020, because you sat down and you talked to a pastor or someone about church and how it's been restricted and how socialists are antagonistic towards religion.
Oh, I mean, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, coronavirus, it's all in the movie. We try to make these movies as if they are ripped out of the headlines. And part of that is when you're making the movie, because we start a movie a year ago, we have to sort of foresee where things are going so that the movie doesn't have that antique, dated quality to it. In fact, I try to go ahead of where things are now. And you'll notice we raise themes in the movie about, for example, the left's domination of culture, themes that will continue beyond the election. They go beyond Trump, and they raise profound questions for where we want our culture to be in the future, regardless of who wins the election.
Right. Well, and the thing that was most striking to me about both the movie and the book is that you talk about identity socialism, and not many people are talking about that. Can you explain to my audience what that is?
Socialism in the classic sense is about the rich and the poor. It's an economic divide. And for Marx, who is sort of the great apostle of socialism, society is divided into two camps. There's the working class, who are the exploited, and there's the capitalist class, who are the bosses, who are the exploiters. But if you look at America today and you talk to socialists now, they divide society in many different ways. Rich and poor, yes, but also black against white, straight against gay, male against female, legal against illegal. So the left is far more divisive than Marx. They want to carve up society in many ways, and their goal is to create a kind of majority coalition of oppressed victim groups. That's why they say we are democratic socialists. We want socialism to be vindicated by popular consent and voted in by a majority of the American people.
Right, and so that's why they need this coalition of oppressed. So they have enough people, enough of a coalition to be able to vote, get that 51% to vote, taxes on the other 49%, basically.
Basically, now the other problem that they have is that the working class generally has been part of the Democratic coalition. If you go back to FDR in the 1930s and early 40s, the white working class was heavily for FDR. But the white working class is also socially pretty conservative. These are people who don't want to overthrow capitalism. They want to benefit from it. They don't want to kill their boss. They want to become the boss. They want upward mobility. They want a better future for their kids. And they like decent, lawful societies. They like cops. They like soldiers. They're patriotic. They like the national anthem. They like the American flag. So many of these guys are now more likely to be found in a Trump rally than to be found at some kind of revolutionary socialist meeting. So the left has had to give up on the working class, and therefore they have to find new people who can fit their revolutionary model. Now, they know that racial grievance is real in this country, and there are blacks who feel that the country has wronged them. So they feel like, why don't we tap this racial grievance? We might have more opportunities this way than we would if we were to go the classic socialist route and try to kind of stir up the working class. That's not a recipe that seems to be working all that well.
Right, and so you have to go and find these other people that they already feel sort of like they're on the outside. And so right now, if you are a white, straight male, you are considered like the new outsider. What was interesting is that you talk about how it's like taking society and kind of flipping it on its head. So it's like we don't even recognize our country anymore. And
yeah, it's an upside down kind of approach. So the white male heterosexual is the villain, and who's the heroine, or who's at the top of the new totem pole? Well, someone like Ilhan Omar, because think about it. One reason Ilhan Omar, and we touch on this topic in the movie, she's committed all kinds of shenanigans, campaign finance violations. She's funneling money to a man that she's involved with. She allegedly married a brother to dodge the immigration laws. But notice she's never indicted. No one goes after her. There aren't even big exposés of her in the major media. Now, why not? The reason is simple. She is a quadruple victim of oppression. She goes, I'm a woman, I'm a person of color, I'm a Muslim who wears the hijab, and I'm a refugee from the desert. So basically, it's like she's grabbed the bottom rung of the totem pole. She's the ultimate victim, and therefore she deserves the ultimate protection, and she can get away with things. That's why people want victim status in America. It gives them an immunity from being held to the same standards as everybody else.
right, she's what do they call that? A transection, or if you have
it's called intersectionality.
Intersectionality, yes, that's what it is. Thank you. She's got all that intersectionality going on, which makes it pretty ironic that Biden's at the head of the Democrat ticket right now, being a white, old, heterosexual male.
Yeah, and when I was in college, the left would rail about what they call dead white males. Why are we reading these books by Shakespeare and Milton? They're dead white males. Well, Biden is an almost dead white male. He's a dead white male who sort of essentially got one foot in the coffin. So you're right, it's a very odd, but I think in a way it makes sense, because the Democrats have realized that they've got so many kooks on their side that they have to try to pick somebody that they can pass off as a normal person. And the best they can do is Biden. Biden is far from a normal person, but the reason they picked him and they pushed all the other candidates out was that they felt that he would set the American people at ease, so they wouldn't be nervous about people, who coming to pull you out of your car and set fire to your house and burn your church and all this craziness. The Democratic Party can't be openly associated with all that. They need at least a kind of facade of normalcy, and that's why they picked Joe Biden.
That makes sense, because we see everything that's going on and we don't associate. And of course, he distances himself from that, even though it's his side that is behind all that. What did he say at that one debate? The Antifa was an idea.
Right. He either says that they don't really exist, or he says things like, well, I defeated the socialist. Well, first of all, he didn't defeat the socialist. If they had had a real primary, Bernie would have beaten him. But the second point about it is that, this is a way to think about it. If you put the free market at one end of the spectrum and you put socialism or complete state control at the other end, and just ask yourself this question: which Democrat is pulling in the free market direction? Well, the answer, none of them. They're all pulling in the socialist direction. Now, they might vary somewhat in degree. You may say that Biden differs from Bernie, kind of like a push differs from a shove. It's a difference of degree, but ultimately with the same end in mind.
Right. And that was in the movie where you showed all the Democrat candidates lined up during the debate, and they were asking them questions. And they were all for giving illegals health insurance, and I can't remember what else. But yeah, it's like but they're all openly embracing socialism, even if they're not all using the word. That's different. That's different than what we've seen in the past. There have usually been at least one or two that were kind of moderate, but none of them are that way now. And you're right about Biden looking normal compared to like BLM. If you do research on them, they're all these, transgender, Marxist women. I use that term loosely, but yeah, they're kind of kookish, and they say that, they're not behind the family, and just all sorts of bizarre behavior. And Antifa's out there saying that words are violence. I mean, that's their whole thing. Words are violence. So if you say something we don't like, we can come back and be physically violent with you. And so, yeah, Biden can't embrace that, because even most of the left, normal, Democrat on the street, doesn't want any part of that. So
no, and the slogan "Black Lives Matter" is, of course, appealing for the simple reason that Black lives do matter.
Right.
But then when you look at the manifesto of Black Lives Matter, they say things like, "We're going to overthrow the patriarchal family." Now, look. Over 70% of Black children today in America are born out of wedlock. Many of these young kids, these young boys, don't have a father. The reason that they're attracted to gangs is that gangs offer a kind of artificial replica or simulacrum of what a family might look like, a sense of belonging, if you will, but not a real sense of belonging, because you're putting your life in danger. You're getting involved in all this criminal activity. You could end up spending years in prison. So if anything, the family is what Blacks in this country need desperately. And yet these Black Lives Matter guys are trying to get rid of the family that does exist. So what could be a greater disaster befalling Black America than to follow this prescription? If Black lives really matter, we've got to get rid of the platform of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, it's really too bad, because the family is the building block of society. And it's like these groups want exactly the opposite of what works and what we need more of in this country, starting with the intact family. And so it's too bad that people don't realize that, although it seems like they're starting to realize that. Black Lives Matter as an organization has lost credibility and lost popularity even with the left. So that's why Biden has to start kind of, distancing himself from that.
For me, I'm a first generation immigrant. I came to America at the age of 17, and I grew up in a country that was socialist, India. The Indian independence leaders all studied in Britain. Many of them studied under socialist academics in Oxford and Cambridge, and they brought this socialism to India. So weirdly, socialism was the last export of colonialism. And the left today says, well, we don't want authoritarian socialism. We want democratic socialism. Well, I grew up under democratic socialism. And for me, it was represented by, my family had a ration card. You could only buy so much rice, so much sugar, so much cooking oil. We were on a 7-year waiting list to get a phone because the phone company was run by the government. And so the bottom line of it is, for me, socialism is represented by scarcity and misery. And India was the begging bowl of the world. And India is only doing better now today because it moved away from socialism. And so pretty much all the Indians know that. But of course, very few Americans do. So part of my work is, sort of bringing this kind of double lens of someone who grew up in a different culture and trying to look at America from the inside, where I've lived most of my life, but also from that outsider perspective that many native-born Americans don't have.
Yeah, it's really too bad more Americans, I would say all the social democrats that I know have never lived in another country. They've never spent any time in a socialist country, so they have no idea. It's all these pie in the sky fantasies of what they think socialism is all about. And I don't know why they don't want to listen to people like you that have actually lived under that system. That just seems crazy.
Yeah, people like me actually make them very angry and very nervous, because they almost feel like I'm somehow, they think it must be that I have now become a sellout to the white man and I want acceptance in white society. So they come up with all these whacked out theories for why I believe the way I do. And they can't accept the simple fact that, look, when you grow up in a different culture, you have some basis of comparison. So when you hear Americans say things like, that's very xenophobic, you realize this kind of fear of outsiders, of foreigners, that's universal. It's not an American trait. And you're able to situate these arguments in a larger context and have some basis of comparison. As you say, the only basis that most Americans have of comparison is they compare America to the Garden of Eden. And when America falls short of perfection, they become infuriated. Things like, why didn't the founders abolish slavery immediately? Well, short answer is because had they tried to do that, the 13 states would never have agreed to join the Union. End of story. So they didn't have the practical option of doing that. But of course, if you're sitting in a 21st century American classroom with air conditioning and under completely different circumstances, it's very easy to lecture 18th century people on what were the real options available to them.
Right, and I don't understand why they don't see that we got to where we're at. We got to this point with air-conditioned classrooms and everything that we have through the free market system. And so if you want, you can't kill that goose that lays the golden egg and expect it to keep making the golden egg. So, you bring in socialism and you kill the goose. They don't seem to understand that.
They definitely do not see that, because if you were to say to young people who are talking about socialism, you say, listen, okay, you are the beneficiary of all these technological marvels that have been delivered to you by the free market system. So if you want socialism, how about you give up your iPhone? Stop using GPS. Don't use an Uber. Forget about Airbnb. So give up this incredible ensemble of new things that your parents never had when they were growing up. And let's see if socialism can produce them independently. They'd be like, what are you talking about? Don't be ridiculous. So they want the benefits of capitalism, but then they also want free college and they want free healthcare. So ultimately, they want to live the life of a privileged drone. Which is to say, I want to basically do nothing. I want to enjoy all these benefits. In a sense, it's perpetual childhood, isn't it? Because when you're a child, your parents look after everything that you have. Any want that you have, you just have to bellow out of your mouth and you expect it to be delivered to you. It's ultimately an inability to grow up and accept the responsibilities of life itself.
Right. Well, like you make the point in the movie and in the book that socialists are basically anti-entrepreneurial. They don't understand the entrepreneur or how he gets where he gets. They think he just supplies the money, which is not how it works. And what also is interesting that the distinction you made between so many of the social democrats here think that they want Swedish socialism, whereas we can't have Swedish socialism because we're not as what's the word, homogenized, I guess, is that society. But they look more, what they really want is Venezuelan socialism, which I don't understand, because if you look at Venezuela, it's obviously a huge failure. People are starving right and left there. But it's interesting that...
yeah, let's remember that the left...
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that the left visits the societies that they like. So Bernie Sanders honeymooned in the Soviet Union. He went to Moscow. He could have gone anywhere. He could have gone to Stockholm or Oslo, but he chose to go to Moscow. Michael Moore, when he in his movie called Sicko, when he was showing the benefits of the socialist healthcare, he went to Cuba. Many of these Hollywood figures, Sean Penn, Danny Glover, Oliver Stone, they went down to Venezuela, embraced Hugo Chavez, because he was their hero. So even though the left says they're following the Scandinavian model, they're really not. The Scandinavians don't demonize the rich. They don't knock down Columbus statues in Scandinavia. They don't practice this racialized politics. They have a welfare state, but they distribute the burden across the whole society. The left has no interest in that type of socialism. They're actually following the Venezuelan model, whether they admit it or not.
Right, and your wife is from Venezuela, right? So she lived back in Venezuela when it was still successful, before socialism was forced on them.
Yeah, she came to America at the age of 10. So she saw Venezuela as a prosperous society. In fact, she moved to the south part of Texas, which is admittedly a poor part of Texas called the Rio Grande Valley. But my wife literally says when she came from Venezuela to America, she thought she was moving to a third world country. This just gives you an idea of how Venezuela was thriving in the 1970s. But of course, the socialists ruined it. And it's now essentially a third world country in which the vast majority of the population lives in misery.
Yeah, and so much of that is to blame on the fact that, was it Maduro that put the bureaucrats in charge of the oil fields and the oil production. It's amazing that you can take a place that's so oil rich and impoverish it so quickly. My sister served a mission over there a long time ago, and it wasn't the way it is now. And now she gets constant old friends from Venezuela asking her for money, just writing up, please send money. You know, she feels bad for them, but I don't know.
Well, imagine, you know, it can work here. You'll have the same result here. Imagine taking a bunch of Bernie Sanders types and putting them in charge of, say, oil drilling. I mean, Bernie Sanders couldn't drill himself out of a golf bag. You know, these guys have no idea what's going on. And essentially that's what Hugo Chavez did. And then later Maduro, they fired all the technical personnel at the oil company, all of whom were competent, but they were like, you people are bourgeois capitalists. Let's put in some people who are like socialist pamphleteers. But of course, those morons have no idea how to get oil out of the ground. All they know how to do is give Bernie Sanders type speeches. And so they ruined their own oil company, and now the Venezuelans are standing in long gas lines, and they have blackouts in an oil-rich country.
And first they took all the guns away, right? So
they disarmed the citizens, and then, before unleashing a reign of terror against them.
Right, I was going to say that was my next step, was that they have these gangs that are sort of Antifa-like, BLM-like, that are not... they're not part of the government, but they take their orders from the government and they go out and terrorize anyone that's not falling in line with the socialist plan there.
Yes, the socialism is ultimately about theft. It's about creating this kind of class of looters who leech off the country. And by the way, we see these signs even at the highest levels of American politics. You know, in Scandinavia, you'll never find a politician who goes from like 0 to 50 million euros on a government salary. Never happens. Mm-hmm. But in Venezuela, when Hugo Chavez died, he was the richest man in the country. His family is currently on the Forbes 400 list. Now, in America, you look at people like the Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, look at Al Gore, look at the Bidens. Now, all these people have been in public service pretty much all their lives. So you ask yourself an interesting question. How do they own multiple homes? Mm-hmm. How do they own private planes? How do they have domestic staff? How do they live the lives of the super rich? They didn't invent the iPhone. They didn't start Amazon. And yet they somehow are able to turn politics into a business. And that's the funny thing. These people talk socialism, but they pay careful attention to their own bank accounts, I can assure you.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what's going on with Biden right now. It's just all coming out that he's got this whole little setup where his brothers and his sons raking all the money for him. And he just conveniently forgets that he met with these leaders over in Ukraine or whatever. That's ugly. It's very ugly. And,
it's very ugly because, well, I mean, a lot of people think Biden is, you know, he's mentally incompetent and so on. But the truth of it is, for most of his career, he's been very competent at this corruption because he knows that he has disclosure requirements. He has to say if he gets money from someone, but see, his family members don't. And so he uses them as bagmen. They go with him while he's having official meetings. Joe Biden, his other family members, James Biden, Frank Biden, the two brothers, or the son-in-law, or Hunter Biden, they're meeting with the officials of the foreign foreign government and striking side deals. Now, Biden knows that it's his influence that he's selling, and that's why he demands that all these family members fork over half of the money to him. That's one of the most stunning revelations in these emails. You know, Pop wants his half because Pop basically figures that that's the reason these guys are getting money is because their last name is Biden. Yep. So the corruption is now coming to light. Much of the media is terrified of this. They don't want to cover it. But hey, the cat's out of the bag. And I think we all know that the game is up. And just if enough of the Americans figure out that they've got a highly corrupt guy at the head of the Democratic ticket, it's hard for me to see how he can make his way to the White House.
I think so too. I don't see how anyone can close their eyes completely to this and hold their nose and just say, okay, I'll vote for him, even though he appears to be the most corrupt politician that we've seen. And I mean, I think he even makes the Clintons look like pikers because he's dealing with communist China. I mean, this is some really, really bad stuff. So I'm glad it's coming out now. But you know, when you say socialism and you say corruption, they go together. You don't ever see one without the other. Well, you can see corruption without socialism, but you don't see socialism without corruption. And so I think Biden's a really good example of, you know, what you do when you get to the top.
Well, the reason for this is that socialism is a form of centralized government control. And the people who champion socialism always want themselves to be in charge of that centralized control. They become the ruling class. And so the opportunities for corruption and abuse are immense. In fact, that's what attracts many ambitious people to be socialists. They don't want it. They wouldn't be for socialism if they were ordinary people whose earnings were being taken away. The reason they're for socialism is they believe I'll be part of the planning class and I will have access to the central pile of loot that will be coming in because of all the high tax rates, all the confiscatory regulation. All the money is going to go into a single pile, and then I can get my grubby paws on it.
Right. But most of them are going to find out that they were useful idiots, and they're going to be left behind. So I'm really hoping and praying then that enough people will realize how awful Biden is. And your movie makes the case for Trump being the only thing that's going to get us past this whole danger right now. And so, you know, I wasn't really a huge Trump fan. I didn't vote for him the first time around, but I've come to the same place that you are, that basically I think Trump's the guy to get us past this immediate danger of our country going socialist.
My wife and I had 45 minutes with Trump last November, and my wife, Debbie, was, you know, she had all these anxieties about Trump. She's a very conventional, kind of low-key Republican, and she didn't like Trump's, you know, style and his heavy-handed manner and so on, and she didn't really understand Trump as a person. And I think it wasn't until she sat up close with Trump that she realized he actually has a vulnerable side. And he's actually personally a very generous man. He seems very scrappy and New Yorky, and he wants to always get into a big verbal fight with people. But if he sees someone who's in need, he'll reach into his wallet and empty his wallet out. And he does this without even thinking. So there's a generosity to the man that actually, I think, humanizes him to a great degree and shows that some of the people who don't like him aren't really judging him right.
Right. Well, and if nothing else, the deals that he's made in the Middle East with Bahrain and the UAE, making peace agreements with Israel, his Supreme Court justice nominations. I mean, there are several things that I would vote for him just on those things alone. So I'm all aboard for the Trump train this time around. With their last few minutes, I just wanted to ask you, do you think that some of these COVID restrictions that we're seeing, you know, on church and with all the masks and everything, that feels to me like sort of a trial run for how would the American people take more authoritarian socialist type leadership?
Yeah, I think it is true that COVID is real, and I'm careful about it. You know, I do a lot of speaking and so on, and I'm very careful. I wear masks. I do all the things I need to do. But on the other hand, I also recognize that this is an epidemic that has been politically manipulated. Yeah. The very fact that you're shutting down the church while allowing the protest shows that there's a double standard underway. And there's no question that there have been restrictions on civil liberties that are not allowed under the Constitution. Remember, the Constitution is not up for democratic referendum. 90% of Americans can't say, well, Dinesh, you don't have the right to believe what you believe, or you don't have the right to practice this faith? Yes, I do. It's not up for you to decide. I never ceded that right to government in the first place. And yet these Democratic mayors and governors have been using COVID to sort of run roughshod over constitutional rights. And the courts have been a little bit slow, I think a little too lethargic in stopping them. So bottom line of it is that sometimes when there's fear, people will agree to things that they wouldn't agree to otherwise. And the Democrats and the left have been using COVID to try to push the country in a socialist direction to take advantage of the crisis.
Right. Well, and I was going to say, if you're not working on another project, I'm sure you've probably got several you're working on, but I think that would be a great book and movie to talk about 2020 and the push for, the push that all these governors made and forced people into, especially California, New York, Michigan. I mean, it's been a really bizarre year, and it's not over. This whole COVID thing's not over. So anyway, I thought I'd just put that idea out there in case you hadn't thought of it, because I would love to see that. So anyway, I really...
Yeah.
Sorry,
no, I appreciate that. And I think that's an interesting idea. Typically, I've been doing all kinds of stuff these days, but I've produced a feature film along with my wife called Infidel, which is out in the theaters now. Of course, the movie Trump Card is out there, which you can watch at home pretty much on any device. And TrumpCardTheMovie.com is where you can find that. And my book, United States of Socialism, I think lays out the blueprint of what it would mean for America to become a socialist society. So I'm focused on those things. And then as the new year comes around and I take stock of where the country is, I'll try to figure out what are the projects to pick up for the road ahead.
Sounds awesome. Well, the book was wonderful. The movie was great. And I've been reading you and watching you for years. So this has been a real treat for me to have you on. I really appreciate that. Everyone go find Trump Card. I watched it on Vudu. And as you mentioned, it's all over the place. But if you go to TrumpCardTheMovie.com, you can find it. I also highly recommend the book, United States of Socialism. Everyone in my family has read it. We all love it. And I thank you so much for putting that information out there. I love that you're such a defender of freedom, and you're keeping us apprised of all the latest attacks on the free market system. So I really appreciate that. Thank you, Dinesh.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for listening to Annette on Life, Liberty, and Happiness, where freedom lovers gather.